Hello and welcome to this session of Members Q&A. The last one I did I called a Tudor miscellany. This one I hope will turn into a miscellany because I'm going to cover more than one question on modern politics, more or less the modern British Constitution and theories, political thought about it. So let's begin with a question from Terence Murray. He begins by explaining nice things about my important work, but he explains his own starting point, which is a good thing. None of us remember his tabula rasa is a blank sheet, although the BBC pretends to be, which is so dangerous. Instead, he does the right thing. He explains where he comes from. As a supporter of Brexit, Terence says, and first past the post, I find it difficult to square that our representatives, that's MPs, should come to their own decisions irrespective of public opinion, which I believe was a point emphasised by Burke. Okay, let's park Edmund Burke. We'll talk about that in a moment. He sees this notion of MPs, this is Terence, not Edmund, he sees this idea of MPs coming to their own conclusions irrespective of public opinion as being typified, particularly during the May premiership. You will remember when a very important section of the Tory party, the Labour Party, the Liberal Party, and the Speaker of the House of Commons and virtually the entire membership of the House of Lords and the civil service did its best to overthrow the verdict of the referendum to leave the EU and to paint that verdict as one that was acquired by childish manipulation, by lies, that it was only advisory and shouldn't stand and all the rest of it. And Terence picks on the actions of a particular MP, David Gauke, who was rather wonderfully known as the leader of the Gaukewood Squad, one of those MPs who was most determined to reverse the verdict of Brexit. You could add others like Dominic Grieve and most importantly the role of the Speaker. Right, so we've got then the idea, is an MP bound to follow what he stood for, the manifesto on which he stood, because of course all of those members, Gauke, Grieve and all the rest of it, stood on a manifesto and were elected on a party manifesto. They were elected on a party ticket, the Conservative Party ticket, and the Conservative Party manifesto made absolutely clear that the party accepted the verdict of Brexit and would stick to that verdict. Incidentally, of course, the whole question of the legitimacy of the referendum and its advisory or non-advisory status was settled again quite conclusively, if extra-constitutionally, by the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, who went out of his way to say that he would regard the verdict of the referendum as binding. In other words, everybody went into the polling booth thinking that it was binding. Right. Let's then go back 2 or 3 stages to the point that Terence was making about the role of Burke. This, of course, is Edmund Burke, the great, arguably, in fact, certainly the greatest conservative thinker, one of the very greatest political thinkers, not so much actual politicians in terms of achievement, but certainly political rhetoricians, extraordinary capacity for eloquence and force, most interesting figures of the later 18th century in England. And the Burke's ideas on the nature of representation, which are very different from the ones that I've been talking about, were formulated in 1780 in a speech that he gave while standing for re-election in Bristol. He was MP for Bristol. He had been MP since 1774, and in 1780 he was standing for re-election. And this is why the speech that he gave, the fact that he is MP, this is why, incidentally, Edmund Burke's statue was one of those that was campaigned for, as I was describing in my video on Edward Colston, whilst Arrowsmith campaigned to have a statue put up not only to Colston, but to begin with to Burke, to refurbish Bristol with that modern notion of a kind of forum filled with the figures of the great and good associated with the history of the city. city. So that's why Burke is in Bristol. Now, why is Burke relevant to this question? It is the speech that he gave. And in the speech that he gave, he disagreed with his fellow MP. In those days, constituencies like Bristol had 2 MPs. His fellow MP had emphasised the duty of the MP to follow the wishes, the clearly stated wishes, the canvassed opinions of his constituents. Burke denies this. He says, I am not a delegate, or I will be not a delegate, but a representative. I owe you, he says, my hard work, I owe you my industry, I owe you the duty to listen to your opinion, to further your interests, but I cannot give you my judgment. My judgment is a sovereign possession of myself. It is given me by God, by my Maker, and I can only answer to him for the exercise and the proper, decent exercise of that judgment as a gentleman, as somebody who cares about my country. And he then goes on to say, and by the way, Parliament, he says, talking of the House of Commons in particular, is not an assembly of nominated delegates. He says instead it's an assembly of representatives. It's a deliberative. It is a deliberate. He uses the phrase the deliberative. Let's get that right. The deliberative assembly of one nation. In other words, the ambassador. He puts it very interesting. He says the representatives that come from Bristol, from Manchester, from all the other. I mean, actually wasn't a seat at that point. That come from the cities and the counties of England, and the towns and the boroughs of England. He says they're not ambassadors from each locality. Instead, they are the common members of a deliberative assembly of one nation. That is 1780. You can just about make a case for it. MPs very much stood on their own reputation, often, generally speaking, financing themselves out of their own pockets or out of the pockets of their patrons. The structure of political parties was relatively weak, had all the rest of it. On the other hand, I think, Terence, you'll like this thought, the electors of Bristol did deliver their verdict, having listened to Edmund Burke say that he wouldn't necessarily follow what they wanted him to do. They threw him out. The electors decided they didn't want him. And of course, since Burke, 1780 is quite a long time ago. It's now 240 years ago. Since 1780, of course, we've seen 2 absolutely fundamental developments, which are very closely associated with each other. We have seen, in Burke's day, the electorate was a few tens of thousands, hundreds of 2,000. It was tiny, absolutely tiny. What maybe, I'm really being very bad on this, I should know more precisely, shall we say 500,000 out of a population which hadn't yet breached, we're still at the end of the 18th century, which hadn't yet breached the 10 million barrier. It's very, very small. As the 19th century goes on, you get first of all the middle classes, then the skilled working classes, then the unskilled, all men of course, then the unskilled, then women, then everybody becoming an authentically democratic electorate. And at the same time as that happens, at the same time, you get the shift to genuine democracy. Can we again be really clear? Genuine democracy in Britain is very recent. We constantly talk about Parliament in earlier periods as a democratic assembly. It is not. It is a representative assembly. Yes, and that's very important, and the reality of its representation does distinguish it from most other European parliaments, most of which, by the way, die. Because they merely, as I've argued before when I've been talking about Parliament, they merely obstruct the business of government rather than cooperate. The medieval English Parliament had developed under the impetus of strong kings. It had developed as a tax-raising machine essentially for foreign war. Anyway, by the later 19th century, we are beginning to become a democracy. But full democracy in Britain is what? It is barely, in fact, it is 100 years old. It's the beginning of the 1920s, and so we're still, if you like, Terence, in an experimental stage as to whether democracy really works, and that question will very much be in my mind when I address a later topic in this session. So we've got then two things. We've got the huge increase of the electorate, and we've got the development of a much more rigid party system, because the only way, Terence, that you can make the verdict of a general election stick is through a proper party system. On the other hand, all democracy would do if you didn't have a party system would revert to what Edmund Burke was talking about. Each town, unless it had negotiated a binding counting each seat, each constituency, unless it had negotiated a binding individual agreement with its MP, the MP would go to London, and then he would be, as Burke said, he would be a deliberative voice in the assembly of one nation. He wouldn't be an ambassador from his constituency. The result, of course, well, we know what the result was. The result was the parliamentary chaos of the May years. There were two aspects to that, of course. It led to a complete defiance of popular opinion. On the other hand, it led simply to chaos. Because what was very striking, even when you had a very sympathetic speaker in the chair, the House of Commons couldn't actually get its own way. It couldn't force the reversal of Brexit. It did everything that it could to do so, but it couldn't actually get it through. It couldn't, for a very good reason. And being a series of fragmentary groups, the Labour Party, the Lib Dems, and one section of the Conservative Party, the SNP and so on, they all had different outcomes that they wanted. There could be no agreement between them. Now, this is very important. It highlights exactly the point that I was making about the fact that most other European parliamentary assemblies disappear in the later Middle Ages, the early modern period, and then when they're reconstituted in the 19th century, as in France, as in the Third and Fourth Republics in France, they perform, or modern Italy, they perform extremely badly and lead to very unstable government. The key is the party system. The party system that an MP stands for one particular party, he stands on that party manifesto, and then when he's elected, this thing that everybody has got very, very head-shaking about, the whipping system keeps him in line. Otherwise, Parliament fragments, the popular will is ignored, and the contempt and disdain for politicians increases steadily. So Burke, I would argue, for once I happen normally to be profoundly sympathetic to Burke. I think he's a most wonderful writer and a quite extraordinary thinker. I'll be talking more about this very shortly. And Burke, I think, got it badly wrong on this. He got it honourably wrong, but he clearly, although very often he was prophetic in understanding developments and the line of development. This is particularly the case in his great work, The Reflections on the Revolution in France. I don't think, well, he couldn't possibly have conceived of the direction of political travel, which is the one that I've been talking about. But a parliamentary assembly, to summarise, Terence, can only operate with a proper party system and a proper system of whipping. If you go in another direction, and it may be that the pressures are now to do this, that in an age, in the internet age, maybe each MP sees himself as a miniature star, able to address directly his constituents through social media. That may well turn out to be the case. It may well turn out to be the case also that the determination, I think it's a profoundly dangerous one, to turn the position of MP into a regular job, into a profession for professional politicians, will make whipping impossible. because of course we've seen the behaviour of MPs like the wonderfully named Ragg, W-R-A-G-G, and campaigning against whipping, saying, this wouldn't be tolerated in any other job, that is this wonderful thing, it's bullying, or it's the applying of illegitimate pressure, or it's bribery and should be referred to the police. All of those things. Well, if we go down that route, so we do in fact revert to something like Burke's assembly of representatives who are the deliberative representatives of a single nation, can I tell you what we will have to do? We would have to rewrite our constitution. Otherwise, we would descend into the chaos of much continental politics. It'd be very simple. You could have a much more active House of Commons. You could have a House of Commons, which again, there have been certain developments in that direction, the setting up of select committees, which begin with Norman St. John Stevens, are enormously developed by John Burke and so on. And you could see the House of Commons becoming much, much more like, say, the House of Representatives in America. Again, MPs being paid much more money, having much larger staffs, assuming a much more independent role. That would mean you could no longer have the Prime Minister sitting in the House of Commons, because he wouldn't actually be able to control it. And the only way that the Premier can survive, and we're seeing this point now with Boris Johnson, is if he can actually control his MPs. In other words, if he's got a secure majority in the House. If he doesn't, his position it trembles. In other words, at that point, the House of Commons becomes, again using the analogy of the American Constitution, it becomes a kind of permanent electoral college for the office of Prime Minister. It's one of the reasons, of course, that we can get rid of malperforming Prime Ministers relatively easily. We can see they can hang on by their fingernails or by their facility as a greased piglet, the wonderful David Cameron's description of Boris Johnson. And unlike Biden, he's just stuck there for the 4 years, even unless he becomes so manifestly senile, even more manifestly senile, that they actually have to do something about it. So if we go down the route of a much more active, independent House of Commons, far fewer stable majorities, opinion forming on itself on specific issues, what we would have to do would be to have a directly elected Prime Minister. In other words, you would separate, and there have been several signs of our going in that direction, you would formally separate the executive from the legislative, because of course we don't have separation of powers in England, in Britain. The executive sits in the legislative, and the executive by and large controls the legislative, controls the processes and the passages of legislation. And as I've argued, as the whole Brexit debacle, or the anti-Brexit debacle of the 2 years of the May presidency demonstrate, the reverse of a presidency, the catastrophic May premiership demonstrated, and the House is not capable of formulating or directing policy. But if you had to have Burke's vision realised, you would undoubtedly have to have a directly elected Prime Minister who would exercise formal executive authority, and otherwise there'd be the permanent instability of government. Right, that's enough on that, Terence, but I hope it. Very interesting question, and again, excellent that we've used Burke, and as I said, it's rather nice to, I find it rather nice to be disagreeing with Burke. I tend to produce nodding solemn agreement whenever his name is mentioned, so it's important to maintain that level of discrimination. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.